I wanted to welcome everybody to the second to last panel of our workshop. I know everyone is probably suffering from a bit of food coma at the moment, but please help yourself to coffee and all that good stuff. Yeah, we'll get started right now. So I wanted to welcome everyone and to this panel, and this panel will focus on new and old identities in diasporic literature. And we've got 3 speakers today, and I'm just going to go and introduce them all. This is sitting next to me is Ching Liu from University of California, Berkeley. She'll be talking about Vietism, Carl Jung, and the New Vietnamese. Next we have Howie Joontang from University of Pennsylvania, who will be talking about Diasporic South Vietnam, literary nationalism in the novels by Lý Thu Ho and Lan Cao. And then at the end we have Phạm Vũ Lan Anh from University of Melbourne and Dalat University. And she will be discussing diasporic identities through the lens of religion from Hoa Pham's Lady of the Realm and Chi Vu's Anguli Ma, a Gothic Tale. So I wanted to welcome everybody, and I guess you're going to go first, is that right? Okay.
Hi everyone, I hope that you will have a wonderful afternoon today. First of all, I want to tell that if you need more information about the detail of my paper, please put it on your slide. In 15 minutes for the presentations, I just want to summarize some main ideas that I've found in 2 novels of Chi Vu and Hoa Pham. When I focus on the writings of Pham and Vu, I found something interesting. First of all, they are both female writers, and they belong to non-first generation writers. Pham was born in Australia, and she can't speak Vietnamese. And Vu, she came to Australia when she was 6 years old as a poor person. So it means that they have the distance with their homeland, distance from geography, from linguistics, from culture. But surprisingly, when I read their works, I found that the link of them with their homeland is so strong and interesting. And another question I found that what links their identities as female writers with their female characters and with their diasporic communities in Australia and the homeland. And the answer is that they are focused on the Buddhism features in their works. So I don't have more time to summarize the plot of 2 novels, so I just want to focus on the main ideas of each writers. The first one I want to tell is Hoa Pham, Lady of the Ring. She wrote this work on 2017. It is the result of her return to Vietnam with the monk Thích Nhất Hạnh. This is the first time he come back home after the long time of living in exile, after from 1966 until 2007. So this return from Vietnam gave her many ideas and confirmed her identity about Vietnamese writing and Vietnamese Buddhism. In her PhD thesis, she also writes that she considers herself an Australian, but in her mind side, she considers herself a Vietnamese Buddhist. So it means that Buddhism has a strong sense and important role in her life and in her career. So in this work, I just want to find out that there are 3 main important poles of Buddhism in her works. The first one, that she borrowed the goddess of Maxis. In Vietnam, we call that Quan Âm Bồ Tát or Phật Bà Quan Âm. And this image that, interestingly, that she didn't speak Vietnamese, but she knows that she borrowed the image of this Buddha from the traditional literature that we also know that it's the Võ Trèo Quan Âm Thị Kính in the 10th century. It's the good point that I think that, how can she know about the Vietnamese traditional literature like this? The second point, I know that, she knows about Buddhism, about Buddha from the work she read from Thích Nhất Hạnh. And this is the second point. that when you read this story, you can find that she wrote about the life of Thich Nhat Hanh, because many milestones in his life will be recovered and we mentioned in his book, like the way he's organized the school for UN service, the way he exiled and the way he come back to country, to homeland. And it's also mentioned about his Thich Nhat Hanh political standpoint. It's very important thing. The last one, I find that when returned to Vietnam, she also focused on many Buddhism events occurred in Vietnam for a long time. The first one is the event of Thích Quảng Đức, who burned himself in the road of Saigon. And from the picture that called the burning monk, we find that she borrowed the image to create the new image of the nun who also burned herself to pray for peace in Vietnam. So it means that she transferred the real event in history to a new event, a new details in her characteristic, to create a woman face to explore her idea about the peace, explore her idea about her identity, explore her understanding about what is Buddhism in Vietnam. This is the first writer. The second writer I want to mention here is Chi Vũ. They're also interesting in Buddhism, but the way the second writer mentioned Buddhism is totally different with Hoa Phạn. And I think that the diasporic condition has a deep impact on this way she chose how to explore its features. The first one, that she also borrowed characters in the old Buddhism folktales named Angulimala, a famous story about the victims who need to kill 1,000 victims. And the last victims in his life is his mother. And to avoid his victim, the Buddha appeared in his arms and gave him the meditation, the lesson to avoid his arm. And after that, he becomes the follower of Buddha. This is the main story from the traditional Buddhism story. But in the story of Vũ, she broke down the name of Angulimala into Angulima, and this is another important point. But she just borrowed the name of the characters in the old story to create the new character in her story. And Angulima in her story mention or present her identity about her political standpoint. Angulima comes from the north of Vietnam. And in another articles, Phạm and Vũ also mentioned that as a second generation and after first non-generation writers, they also need a voice to support for the south of Vietnam. So in their works, what comes from the north of Vietnam give her the negative meanings. In the first author, the Viet Minh come from the north is called invader. From the work of Chi Vũ, Angulimala also comes from the north, and after that he becomes a murderer. The first one. The second one, that Chi Vũ is so intelligent to connect the God story in Buddhism tradition and the God story in Gothic literature to create the new term of Gothic in diasporic writings. And the God story in diasporic writing is not a new thing in literature, because you also find out the gods in Việt Thanh Nguyễn, refugees, or another work of African diasporic communities. But in this way, the gods in Chi Vũ also mention us about the ill fate, victims of many poor people who die in the bottom of the ocean. I think this is a good way to remember someone missing in our life. And last but not least, Chi Vũ is very interesting in Gothic literature. And I think that is the result when she lives in Western culture, who Gothic is more familiar than in Vietnam. And in this aspect, she finds that Gothic literature can mix with the dark side of Buddhism culture when she wants to focus about the philosophy of life is suffering in her work. So I think that they also have some different way to tell about their own story, to connect with their experience, to tell something about their life in Australia. But it also will mention about the life of Vietnamese people in Vietnam, before they escape the country to find something what we call nowadays is peace and freedom. Thank you so much.
And next we have Howie Joontang.
Good afternoon. I'm Howie Tam. I am not going to present on the paper that I circulated. But here we are. I will talk about other examples, not including in the excerpt that I circulated, but I'm making essentially the same point. So if you read the paper, you will see resonances, but more examples. And if you haven't read the paper, you still get the point, and you can read it for more extensive treatment of what I'm saying. But first of all, I want to thank Professor Dumbo for giving me this opportunity to share my work with you, and more importantly, to learn from you. And I want to acknowledge that as a PhD in English, specializing in American literature, I have had to train myself in Vietnamese studies, and so a lot of you actually know me through your published work, and I'm, really love this experience of meeting you in person. I'm currently the assistant director and postdoctoral fellow at the Consortium of Studies in Race, Migration, and Sexuality at Dartmouth College. Louder? Okay, sorry. I hate raising my voice, but here. So I'm working at the RMS Consortium at Dartmouth. And I know it sounds probably like this American studies thing. And that's because it is. And we have heard critiques of this American studies, especially this self-critical anti-imperial American studies that's upholding the anti-war orthodox narrative of Vietnam War studies, and yes, that is true. However, there's space to challenge that in such a space, and I am being hired into it, right? And they know what I'm working on, so I'm just saying that it is not easy, but there's space to challenge that narrative from within, and I really am a strong advocate for interdisciplinary studies, and this is what we needed. So, more to the point of the workshop here, I would like to meditate on what a study of post-war diasporic Vietnamese literature from France and the United States has to offer scholars concerned with Republican Vietnam. And that's the dissertation work that I've been doing, that I finished. And as an oblique way to answer that question, I will revisit a discussion thread that Peter Zinnerman offered us yesterday. And by that I mean his reading of Viet Nguyen's The Sympathizer. To recap, Professor Zinnerman critiqued the text for towing the orthodox line of the Vietnam War discourse by depicting the RDN, its politicians, and its society in a reductive way. As it so happens, The Sympathizer is in one of my chapters, so I want to offer a quick alternative reading of the text. To argue that the spirit of the Republic of Vietnam permeates diasporic literature in France and the US, I want to show how this literature maintains an oppositional streak vis-a-vis the current Vietnamese state, even when it may at first glance seem to follow the orthodox regime of representation. Any discussion of Viet Nguyen's narrative style, including the issue of whether or not the narrator's voice is that of Viet Nguyen himself, must take into consideration that this story takes the form of a confession. We learn from the narrative that the unnamed protagonist has been captured by the communists and put in a re-education camp. And the account that we read is the confession that he has had to write in order to earn his freedom. The confession genre, the novel makes clear, relentlessly disciplines the protagonist by holding the commandant's satisfaction as a condition for his exoneration and liberation. No wonder then that the text must ostensibly critique the RBN. It's required by the genre itself. According to Michel Foucault, confession is a ritual that unfolds within a power relationship. For one does not confess without the presence or virtual presence of a partner who is not simply the interlocutor, but the authority who requires confession, prescribes and appreciates it, and intervenes in order to judge, punish, forgive, console, and reconcile. As a form of knowledge power, the truth attributed to the confession does not unilaterally come from the writing subjects. It results from an unequal collaboration with the authority and a necessary affirmation of the dominant order. Nevertheless, there is subversion at work. Since the commandant already presets the confession's form and content, the protagonist seizes on style as his mode of defiance. People who've been in re-education camps would tell you, right? A confession is already written, you're just writing it the way that people expect you to write it. You don't get creative about your confession, right? So the ground is already set. You just have to admit to it. And if you don't, you're not leaving, right? So this is what the narrator says in The Sympathizer. If I am to be condemned, if I am already condemned, as I suspect, then I will do no less than explain myself in a style of my own choosing, regardless of how you might consider my actions. Because state power, through the confessional dynamic, believes itself able to contain and manage the transgressions named in the confession, style marks the frontier of the confessor's submission. The protagonist refuses to kneel at this very threshold, and his defiance throws the whole project and the commandant's power in doubt. His stylistic agency reveals the bad faith of the text's production. The commissar in the text, the commandant's subordinate and the second reader of the confession, detects the danger of the protagonist's scheme. He says, "You claim to be a revolutionary, but your story betrays you, or rather you betray yourself." Viet Nguyen, in this instance, makes use of the double meaning of the word betray. One, to fail or to desert, especially in time of need, right? And the second meaning is to show. In his stylistic nonconformity, the protagonist fails himself, but he also shows his true self. Self-betrayal allows self-representation in this case. And by pointing out the protagonist's fake communist belief, the commissar's condemnation also discovers the protagonist as a non-communist all this time. At this point, the reader may then see the confession as a South Vietnamese spy's report on the communist regime, a reversal of the role that he claims to play from the novel's beginning. The reader understands that the protagonist ingratiates himself with the commandant in order to earn his freedom. Yet, when the narrator uses the pronoun you in direct address, as in, "I suspect, my dear commandant, that this confession is not what you are most likely used to reading," the reader cannot help but occupy the position of the narrative police. The text's interpolative slippage places the reader, and I'm assuming an American reader, in an ethical predicament. They ought to reflect on their consumption of this diasporic fiction and by extension their responsibility for the war's legacy. The sympathetic tie between left-leaning anti-war Americans and Vietnamese communist revolutionaries underpinned various social movements of the 1960s. The novel, however, severs this historical transnational tie. The intolerant commandant who orders the torture of the narrator should inspire only abhorrence from a sensible reader. The novel, in effect, gives the reader no good choice but to disidentify from the communist tyrant. The novel's double-tongued second-person address asserts a constant push and pull on the assumed American reader, who must bear the double consciousness of having to identify with and turn away from the commandant. Elsewhere, Nguyen has critiqued the tendency of the anti-war sentiment to, quote, keep others in their innocent place while keeping the guilty West's upper hand above the pitiful rest, right? And that's from Nothing Ever Dies. This leftist self-flagellation, his word, risks purifying the former communist enemy into a perfect victim incapable of unjust violence, an illusion that the post-war refugees who fled from communist atrocities would seek to dispel. The sympathizer's critical double cut symptomatizes diasporic fiction as a conceptual third space to critique both the US and Vietnam. Put differently, the South Vietnamese national spirit rears its head to assert its stance against both the US and communist Vietnam through this recently canonized American novel. So the excerpt that I circulated for this workshop makes the same argument about the presence of South Vietnamese nationalism in diasporic literature, only in more explicit terms. The chapter where the excerpt comes from looks closely at two prime examples of diasporic South Vietnamese fiction, both novel sequences, each with its own literary nationalism. And nationalism that I'm using is plural, nationalisms, because I think each writer has their own version of it. These novel sequences deal directly with the political strife of the RVN and its post-state affects. The first is the untranslated trilogy by French-Vietnamese novelist Lý Thu Ho, Bereft Springtime, Printemps inachevé, published in 1962. At the Crossroads, au milieu du Calafou, 1969, and The Illusion of Peace, Le Mirage de la Paix, 1986. The second series is a pair of texts by Vietnamese-American author Lang Cao, Monkey Bridge, 1997, and The Lotus and the Storm, 2014. Despite the author's different novelistic aesthetics and linguistic audiences, their texts match well together in a critical frame as they represent and interpret the strife of the RVN with its noble mission and all of its irredeemable faults. Strung on a chronological timeline, the 5 novels whose publication dates range over 50 years from the early 60s to the early 2010s cover the story of the southern state from its prehistory in the 40s to its contemporary diaspora. Each author employs the sequence structure for her novels not only to show her characters and their country's development through the decades, but also to rework preceding ideas as history unfolds. Occupying that uncertain terrain called diaspora, these texts are national narratives outside the nation, nestled in the literary worlds of France and the US at the risk of misapprehension and perpetual marginalization. So I will end my presentation with an example that I omitted from the circulated excerpt. This example comes from Lang Cao's first novel, Monkey Bridge, the first single-author Vietnamese-American novel written in English for the larger American readership. Lang Cao is also the daughter of Cao Van Vien, the chief military advisor to President Nguyen Van Thieu and chairman of the RVN Joint General Staff. Unsurprisingly, this novel has been read as an ethnic immigrant narrative, right? In the United States, Michiko Kakutani at the New York Times, for example, considers this novel, quote, a story about immigrants grappling with the mind-boggling possibilities and confusions of American life, reinventing themselves as they go along, end quote. But if America is supposed to offer optimism, good opportunities, comfort, safety, right, remedies for wartime atrocities, the teenage protagonist in Monkey Bridge, and her name is Mai, seems unable to accept America as such. Here she is, right before she leaves for college to receive a world-class education, the ticket to the American dream. Quote, a few more minutes and it will all be over. Keep calm, simplify, everything will be all right. You're not going to have to see any of these people all over again, ever again, once you leave for college. So everything, but everything will be just fine. A brand new slate, that was what my mother has supposedly given me. A slate unmarred by any undercurrents or tremors of Saigon or even of Falls Church, Virginia. Control. Everything is order and control. My struggles with the stark contradiction between her supposed tabula rasa to be filled with new knowledge in college and her intense apprehension that threatens to break her down at any moment, between a thrilling beginning and a baleful past. The series of panicky repetitions of simplify everything and control read like a chant with which mind tames a hovering specter. This eerie unease, I suggest, is a stubborn South Vietnamese nationalism that is too beholden to America to reckon with. One wrong move is a diasporic South Vietnamese anxiety that Mai's parents have bequeathed to her. Of course, Mai cannot have a clean slate, and she will have to enter college and assume a U.S. citizenship forever marred by this out-of-place national affect lying in wait. Thank you.
And next we have Ching Lu.
Thank you, Martina. In the essay that was circulated, I present Vietism as, above all, a vision of future man. And there I focus on two scholars, Lưu Kim Đình and Nguyễn Ngọc Nhạc. Both were preeminent thinkers of their day. Before 1975 in South Vietnam, each had a towering reputation. Lưu Kim Đình as a philosopher, and Nguyễn Ngọc Nhạc as a novelist and an essayist. Through the stories that they wrote, I gradually bring center stage the new Vietnamese, their idea for what the Vietnamese would look like, act like, think like, were he to tap into the collective unconscious that his ancestors had left for him. Lưu Kim Đình and Nguyễn Ngọc Nhạc, each in his own way, had a grand vision. The new Vietnamese, they thought, would arrive to one day overthrow communism in his homeland. But more than that, they believed that he, above men of any other race, would be the one to bring about peace and happiness to all the world over. If you have any questions about Vietism, as I discussed in the paper, how it came about, what traditions it stood on, who shaped it, and when it made its way into Vietnamese fiction, I would be happy to answer them during the Q&A. For now, given that I only have 15 minutes, I'd like to provide just a sense of what Vietism meant to Lưu Kim Đình by addressing one question, and it is this. What does the branch of psychology that Carl Jung pioneered, a long discredited science, have to do with the future of Vietnamese? After 1975, as more and more Vietnamese were rounded up for re-education, and millions glided out to sea, some took the frontiers or went underground, fighting to the last with weapons of whatever kind. Those who found their way out of the country regrouped. They took to the streets in Paris, Berlin, Washington, D.C., Melbourne, to call the communist government to account. They fundraised to help refugees, and many turned to the UN for help. Others, vowing to restore South Vietnam in the short run, staked their fortunes on the search for a strong man. As their efforts crested, a number of RVN intellectuals, and among them Kim Đình, then finding refuge in Missouri, paused. They looked at Vietnam and seeing how men were hunted down or hounded out of society, they feared that there would be no end to the slaying. And turning their gaze back to the Vietnamese abroad, then settling in different corners of the world, they saw trouble still. The militant corps that sprang up around this time had trained their weapons on each other, suspecting fellow refugees of working for the enemy. And local newsletters warned that a kind of cultural bankruptcy had impaired the Vietnamese, some of whom ethically lost, formed cliques to tear the community apart. So whether in Vietnam or outside it, the Vietnamese appeared to Kim Đình to have lost their way. To Kim Đình, some kind of psychological disorder, a split personality perhaps, had afflicted his people, causing them to act incoherently, like men without a soul. And if this were allowed to go on, Kim Din feared that the Vietnamese would be doomed to disappear. He thus set about finding a national soul, which he hoped could restore the Vietnamese back to health, training each to forsake his small vanity for the greater good. It may never have occurred to anyone else but Kim Din to turn to Carl Jung for some guidance. In his freestanding volume, published in 1979, this lifelong Catholic priest outlined a program for finding that soul set adrift so long ago. And one way he thought was for the Vietnamese to break free from the mass. Kim Din saw the mass in the Jungian sense as a force that keeps man from looking into himself, that possesses him, depriving him of the decision as how to live his own life, such that he becomes part of the unconscious herd, ruled, clothed, fed, and educated as a social unit. So taking on Carl Jung's view of man, Kim Din casts the contemporary Vietnamese as the product of a psychic infection, a dissociation between consciousness and the unconscious, an unnatural and even pathological condition, a loss of soul even. This may be seen most clearly in the great socio-political movements, such as socialism and communism. So Kim Din suggests that the herd mentality first took shape in Vietnam in the 19th century under French rule, and then evolved into its vilest form under socialism. And by the 20th century, the Vietnamese had effectively become a parable for the modern man, plagued so deeply by a psychic epidemic that he stood defenseless against the mass. So Western psychoanalysis had opened to Kim Din a view of Vietnamese history and the violence that it wrought as either the consequence of overlooking the human psyche or the consequence of negating it, as the socialist state did. Jung casts a long shadow over Kim Din as he reflected on how to turn the Vietnamese into a whole being. So firmly holding on to that vision, he tried to tap into the collective unconscious, which, according to Jung, comprises the psychic life of our ancestors right back to the earliest beginnings. Archetypes are the building blocks of the collective unconscious. They are the symbols which are older than historic man, which are inborn in him from the earliest times, and eternally living, outlasting all generations. According to Jung, this storehouse of symbols, existing in the dark psyche of every man, lies ready for use. So Kim Din likened this notion of the collective unconscious to the soul of rivers and mountains, the national soul. Inspired still more by Jung, Kim Din thought that rituals could bring the Vietnamese closer to his inner being, and thereby cutting loose the state's hold on him. He believed that rites could reactivate the powers slumbering in the psyche. So when Kim Din claims that the highest purpose of rituals is to bring one closer to the primordial man, he's drawing on Jung's belief that religious experience allows the conscious mind to preserve its link with the unconscious. And when Kim Din further claims that contact with the primordial man would restore some unity to the psyche, he seems to accept Jung's premise that self-realization is possible when symbols, projected by the unconscious, are folded into consciousness. And convinced as he was, Kim Din announced in 1984 that now as ever, activities aiming at perfecting man like poetry, rites, dance, game, and above all, music, are needed to unlock the collective unconscious and the Vietnamese soul. So Vietnamese letters and the arts were to become the medium tying consciousness to the unconscious, man here and now to the primordial man, the earliest Vietnamese who represents an original way of life ruled, according to Kim Din, by the mother. To Kim Din, Vietnamese civilization was once matriarchal, peaceful, benevolent, when life had not yet broken away from the harmony of nature. 1982 saw him lay out two cultural stages that he thought defined Vietnamese history. One presided over by women, and the other dominated by statesmen and hence motherless. He describes an early Vietnamese society based on the religious and civic role of the mother. The Vietnamese in this matriarchal state is said to have achieved a noble agricultural life as they worked the land, held together by a love for the home soil, we can say. They lived harmoniously. So Kim Din suggested that as a general course of evolution, this society at last yielded to paternal rule in order to protect itself from foreign aggression. But over time, the shift to father rule displays more and more the original mode of life, such that by the 20th century, descendants of the Vietnamese could no longer sense the divinity of the mother. They thus, according to him, usher in a Western culture full of masculine drive, which quickly took hold and gave rise to an imperium ruled through law and reason. Kim Din elsewhere goes on to say that communism is a sign that a civilizational schizophrenia had seized the Vietnamese long ago. But hardly his own, Kim Din's concept of a mother-centric order was taken from Johann Backhofen's pioneer theory of mother right. In 1861, this Swiss anthropologist drew on myth, literature, material artifacts, to argue that a primitive state of matriarchy had flourished before Greek polities came about. Back then, when farming allowed nomads to settle down, descent was traced through women. And before the shift to a paternal system, the relationship which stands at the origin of all culture, of every virtue, of every nobler aspect of existence, is that between mother and child. Nguyen Hong Yak would later use this motif of mother and child to further define Pietism. But in any case, Kim Din glosses his notion of mother right as the mother principle and less often as matriarchy. And echoing Backofen, Kim Din claimed that traces of this primordial world are still present in myth, which when studied could reveal something about our culturally structured souls. But unlike Backofen, who examined myth in order to come a little closer to the meaning of things, Kim Din wanted to redeem the mother principle to one day revive this lost culture. In his view, the ancient world was something of a utopia, where man and nature, consciousness and the unconscious, spirituality and sensuality had not yet separated. This represented to Kim Din a supreme harmony in which the early Vietnamese had lived. Though he freely borrowed passages from Mother Right, Kim Din also revised this with scholars' theory along the way, where Backofen evoked the age of the mothers as a cultural stage that has passed, no longer accessible. Kim Din saw Vietnamese antiquity as both historical and eternal. So a world that is forever out of reach to Backofen is to Kim Din a part of the collective unconscious, which is always there as a resource and as a force to transform man. So merging Backofen with Jung, Kim Din saw the Vietnamese primordial mother as an image laid down in the collective unconscious, in every man, and as a force for self-development and redemption. So if through Jung, Kim Din had detected a psychological disorder in the modern Vietnamese, it was then in Backofen that he found a cure. The only way forward for the Vietnamese, he said, is to find the archetypal mother. To Kim Din and others like him, the mother is the collective unconscious, the mytho-poetic source of consciousness, the Vietnamese inner character. They believe that if he dug deep enough, every Vietnamese would recover a link to the primordial mother he once shunned. She would guide him in his development so that he would move closer to the sacred goal of self-rule to one day, when brought together with those like him, overthrow communism in his homeland. So in due time, they presented this lofty ideal, Pietism, as a model not only for their kin, but also people of the third world to establish peace and happiness on which all races could flourish. The Vietnamese believed they were poised to lead this universal crusade for freedom, and in that belief, they opened the way for something quite messianic. Thank you.
Okay, so we started about kind of 10 minutes late, so I say we have about maybe about kind of half an hour, 25 minutes for Q&A. So I guess we could start taking questions. Yes, Sui.
So I have a question for Jung. So could you clarify the critique of communism and stuff and deitism? So is it basically, it's schizophrenic because there's a disconnection between the unconscious and the conscious, and so is it the criticism that communism represents some kind of reign of pure rationality that sort of disconnects the self from the unconscious?
Before I answer your question, could I perhaps nominate Kim Din as yet another figure that is worthy of not just one, but perhaps 32 dissertations, because he wrote 32 books. But yes, in some ways, Kim Din complicates our work and definition of republicanism and anti-communism. He sort of gives a longer genealogy for communism in Vietnam. It did not start, as many historians would think, in the 1930s and 1920s. He thinks that it traces back all the way to the beginning of, actually the beginning of French rule. And that is when he says the Enlightenment values such as rationality, construction of the self, and the construction of constitutional legal law became the basis for the development of communism in Vietnam.
Other questions?
Yes, I have a question for Liu. In your presentation, you showed the two pictures with giáo sư Kim Din and nhà văn Vũ Mộc Giác. But then, during your, maybe you don't have time, but you didn't elaborate much about what is Vũ Mộc Giác in relation to Vietism in this manner here.
Thank you for giving me an opportunity to discuss a portion of my paper that I could not bring into this presentation at all. Vũ Mộc Giác, I think, is one of the core figures of Vietism, partly because it's in his writing, especially from 1982 and onward, when he came to California. You can see traces of Vietism in much of what he wrote. One of which is a story in the collection Nguyen Nang Kinh Bong Surrender, where he uses the motif of the mother and the child as a way to think about how the Vietnamese abroad, and we have to take into context the militant nationalism that's taken place in different pockets of the world where the Vietnamese congregated. So in that context, how do you turn the Vietnamese into a peace-loving people, but also at the same time think about a different future for his country? And I think he was very taken by the ideas that Kim Din proposed. And that one story, the Vietnamese, the new Vietnamese, which he wrote in sort of in contradistinction to the new Vietnamese, the new socialist Vietnamese that was then being constructed in Vietnam, the con người xã hội chủ nghĩa mới, yes, that. So there, his model for the Vietnamese is very much like Kim Din. For the new Vietnamese, is very much like Kim Din's. It's sort of an amalgam of three different figures, you can say. One is the hero archetype from Carl Jung. And according to Jung, the hero archetype arises when there is a moment of real personal or national upheaval. And the hero archetype is supposed to bring together rationality, reason, and with passion and feeling. And he is supposed to transcend all national divides. And one other image is that of and you might see this if you were to read the paper, the Nietzsche's superhero, right? The Superman. The Superman is an emblem for the master race. Yeah, because they truly believe that Vietnamese, above men of any other culture, had something to contribute to the philosophy of humanism.
I have a question. I have a question for Howie Joontang. And throughout the literature of the diaspora, there is a common thread, and that is the voyage of self-discovery, okay, of an individual or a group or individual couple with his or her original identity and the new identity that they have to adopt, right? And that brings me to the sympathizer again, because although this is billed as a political suspense or novel, etc., but pervading throughout the book is the search of the identity of the, well, sympathizer, because he sympathized from his culture and the new culture. And nowhere do I find this thread in the book more than the character, you know, that one of the characters that the sympathizer has adopted, you know, or in his various iterations, namely the authenticity advisor. You remember that one? So I think it's very telling, because this is where the Vietnamese, excuse me, of diaspora looking for the definition of his own identity, faced with a new challenge of a new culture. And in a way, it's adversarial, because we came here under very special circumstances. Okay? And this is what I submit that the overriding theme of the sympathizer, and which connects with the theme of all the other writers of the diaspora. Okay?
Thanks for that reading. I guess I would just add to that by saying that, again, back to my point, that the account that we read, the novel that we read, is a confession. So it's written for the commandant, right? The communist commandant is the first reader. The American reader is the second reader. So I think that people are piqued by the didactic tone of that text, right? Sometimes it feels like a college professor teaching you things. And you know, some people say that's a failure of his style, right? Because you're not supposed to write in that way, you know. But from the way I read it, it's actually another subversive tactic of the narrator teaching the commandant something about America, to break down that hatred of the enemy, right? And also to educate the communist reader of the diaspora and what its aspirations are, and its suffering, its pain, its, you know, the violence that he's gone through. So he's using his confession as a space to educate the communist reader, which is a very inappropriate use of a confession. You don't teach anyone with a confession, right? You have to show that you have already learned something from your mistakes. So that's how I read the text as well. And I think that kind of search for authenticity is definitely there, right? And you also have a character who is mixed race, right? And who doesn't, who has a very complicated understanding of his father. He hates his father, who's, you know, a French man, and who's lost the country, doesn't know where he is. But I think there's a lot of work being done in that text to not necessarily to, again, regurgitate this kind of like, oh, South Vietnam is bad, you know what? I don't think it tells the anti-war like at all. I do think it does way more work than meets the eye.
My question is addressed to Jung and Howie. You guys are way too deep for me. where can I have your dissertation in their entirety? Because it's very difficult for me to follow you guys. But my philosophy jives with Kim Din's philosophy. Kim Din thinks communism is schizophrenic. I think communism is murderous, psychopathic also.
Yes, I will be happy to send along my my complete dissertation if you would like to read it. If I could just, I feel as though I didn't adequately answer your question earlier when you were asking about Wong Yak. Could I give that another try? I like to answer that by just calling your attention to this image here in the last slide. Some of you here might recognize this as the insignia of the Provisional Government of Vietnam, which recently, I think at the start of this year, has proclaimed itself to be the third republic of Vietnam. Yes. It was founded in 1990, and the first Prime Minister, Đào Minh Quang, says that he is Kim Din's heir. He is a Truyền nhân of Kim Din. And so since 1990, it's managed to set up representative offices around the world. And I think late 2017, it actually called for a referendum for free elections in Vietnam and received over 1 million votes. And that's one of the reasons why it claims itself now the Republic of Vietnam. Yes. But if you look at the insignia, what you see in the middle is the mother. And then her feet is transplanted a portrait of Ho Chi Minh. This is representative of one of the induction rituals for this government. If you want to become part of the government, you have to show proof that you have no loyalty to Ho Chi Minh whatsoever. And this is one way people do it. Another is tearing up his pictures. Another is flushing it down the toilet. You can imagine the creative ways people do that. And then to her side, you see the communist flag nailed down by a sword. And of course, in her arms is a child wrapped in the flag of South Vietnam. This is supposed to represent the new Vietnamese. And that child is not necessarily a human child. That child is about each Vietnamese searching within himself to find a higher being. It's a message about self-development and self-perfection, self-cultivation. And this is the image that we can find in Nguyen Mong Yak using over and over again in his writing.
Hi, my question is also for Jin Nu. So I guess Kim Din is using Jungian archetypes to talk about taking the path of the female and recovering the primordial mother and all of this, but it strikes me that almost verbatim you can see these kinds of ideas in yin-yang theory, in Taoism, in popular religion. So I'm wondering, does he talk about that at all? I mean, why use Jung to get to these ideas when there's so many obvious, should we call them indigenous sources for these sorts of ideas? That kind of interests me.
I think thank you for that question. I think one way to answer this question is to look at Kim Din's past. Even though he published over 30 books, even though he had a sizable following, remarkably little is known about his private life. We know that he was from Nam Dinh, born in 1914, some say 1915. And by his early 20s, he was ordained as a priest. And in the 1940s, for about 10 years, he had a stint in Europe studying at the Catholic Institute, studying sociology, anthropology, Confucianism, sinology, and others. And I think it was after that, in the 50s, he would return to Vietnam, teaching at 3 places, Bang Hanh University, Saigon University, and eventually Dalat University. And I think it was during his 10-year stay in Europe that he picked up, that he read and was attracted to the writings of Carl Jung and others, and Bachofen even. The interesting thing about Kim Din's use of Jung is that it's not, I mean, he does adopt the archetypes to talk about the Vietnamese soul, and he has different words to talk about the Vietnamese soul. There's Dai Nga, Dân tộc, there is Hồn Sông Núi, Hồn Nước, Dân tộc Tánh, and a few others. I mean, it's scattered throughout his writings. But he made a few changes to Jung's theory. One is that for Jung, the collective unconscious is shared by all. All human beings have the common collective unconscious, and even animals too. But for Kim Din, it's only the Vietnamese who have access to a Vietnamese collective unconscious. In that sense, it is limited by race and by culture. So one of the things is because he adopts another aspect of Carl Jung, saying that the collective unconscious is something that is physiologically inherited, which means it could be part of the Vietnamese unending evolution, as it were. Right? The experiences of all the ancestors who go before us become part of the collective unconscious, and that collective unconscious is passed on through not only the cultural artifacts that we create, but also through the inherited brain structure, according to Jung. So I think that those two aspects allowed him to be a bit more creative about how he thinks about the Vietnamese soul.
Thank you very much for your expose. And that gave me some thought about how younger Vietnamese would think about Kim Din and Thich Nhat Hanh, which many older people don't really take them very seriously. There's two things in your common theme. Number one is the roots of Vietnam is the mother, Mẹ Việt Nam. The theme of Mẹ Việt Nam is not I Kim Din. Everybody else. In many songs, there's a song about Mẹ Việt Nam, where you can see that is, you can raise it collective consciousness. That's number one. So it's not quite new. The second thing is about they want to look for, and even with that to a certain extent, look for universal solution for mankind, just not for Vietnam. And that also have a roots in the ambitions of the Vietnamese. They only think themselves as a center of the universe, a la mode of just a la Chinese. And number two, they only want to think about that. Before Kim Din, before Nguyễn Ẩn Đã, the leader of Duy Dân, Lý Đông A, already have wrote a number of people thinking of a solution for all Vietnam. Because at that time, there's a conflict between Marxisms and Fascisms. And he wanted to find a different way. So he invented. So it's not new at all. Now for not footnote, he mentioned Đào Minh Quân, who claimed himself to be disciple of Kim Din. Đào Minh Quân, as you probably, if you read Vietnamese news, you see that every year or even every week, he published a new list of cabinet members, which is prime ministers. And I was lucky I was not in there, he didn't know. So if you think of anybody, he put in there. So Đào Minh Quân was not considered very serious.
You will be tomorrow.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that. Thank you.
I have a question for all three presenters. I think now we are entering into the diaspora proper, the post-1975 diaspora, even though it has been referenced throughout today, and this morning and yesterday. I wish to ask you, on your respective works, your scholarship, how do you, I haven't seen the word exile, or exilic come up. I think it pop up here and there. How would you approach, that? Because I think, at least for the first generation of refugees in the 70s and 80s, if not beyond, that was crucial to their identity, and I think different groups of people deal with it differently. The Catholics, they think of themselves, they compare themselves to the Israelites in Egypt, for example, and other groups may have different ways of dealing with it, and I suspect, Kim Din and Yak have their own way of dealing with this exilic experience. And then, in the literature of the 1.5 and second generation as well. So.
Thank you for your questions. I just want to mention that writing between the diaspora and exiles is not a new phenomenon. It means that it occurs in many writings, and many scholars also mention about this. But in my writings about Phạm and Chi Vũ, I also mentioned that two female writers also mention about the between diaspora and exiles to be more clearly. For example, in the case of Phạm, she also focused on the exile status of Thích Nhất Hạnh. And she also focused on the exile life of Thị Kính, the afterlife of Quan Âm, when she forced to live far away from her communities in the federal societies. I think that its punishment is much more worse than the death. This is the main point. And in the works of Vũ, she also mentioned about the afterlife of Angulimala after he received the meditation of Buddha. But it's also the dark life, the sorrow. And he also mentioned that the started of exile of Vietnamese people also lasts forever after they find the new safe country to live like Australia. These sorrows even can end for any times, and it will remain in their mind forever. Yeah. So it means that another reason I want to mention here is for the second generation writers and first 1.5 generation writers, they also find that diasporic contents or conditions also give them the opportunity to explore main characteristics of their communities. And they can find out many things in the Western country to adapt well with the way they think about their own communities in this way.
So I did think a lot about exile versus diaspora as guiding terms, and I decided to go with diaspora because to me exile marks loss and melancholia, and I don't want to go with that kind of mode of analysis that emphasizes on loss and constantly looking at what is deprivation. I look at diaspora because diaspora connotes a certain relationship to the homeland from abroad, and this is something that you get from Jewish thinking about diaspora as well. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is there is a dialectical relationship between diaspora and homeland. And I find that much more generative because diaspora then becomes a space that is outside of the nation state, right? So you can be in France or United States, but you can write about Vietnam, but not a Vietnam right now. It can be Vietnam that's been lost. It can be an imagined Vietnam, right? It's more creative. There's more space for innovation and literary creation, and I like that. Because I think of diasporic literature as not always about mourning and thinking about, oh, woe is me. Yeah? I mean, I guess there's some of that, but I think about it as like, all right, let's create. Let's keep creating South Vietnam, right? Let's keep creating what we think to be South Vietnam in English, in French, in whatever languages that we use. And I find that more exciting.
I can just quickly add, I think the choice to use exile, diaspora, refugee, or immigrant, even, has to do with the phase of development of the Vietnamese American community. Immediately after 1975, after 1976, those who went abroad did not see themselves as exiles at all. In fact, they were thinking that they were taking a short study abroad program, that they were going to return one day very quickly. So that those terms were not really used, not until the early 1980s when Eugene and a few others discussed which do we use to describe ourselves, exiles or diasporic. And I don't think they ever came to a consensus on which to use, and I think much of that was left open to whoever wants to those who needed to use those terms to describe themselves. These days, I see us perhaps adopting one or the other, exile versus diaspora, as a way to distinguish one wave of immigrant from another, say Vietnamese who come from Vietnam much later on, either through study abroad programs or through family reunification or whatever else. So I don't really have a good reason for why I choose to use one or the other. I think most of it is for based on sensibility and what sounds right to the ear.
I've got them. So I feel like I'd like to respond to Howie because I recognize that it takes a lot of moxie and courage to change your presentation mid-conference to address the paper of a senior person who delivered his talk the day before. And also it takes a lot of skill, I think, to do it as subtly and intelligently as you did. And the point you raise is I think, a really interesting one. It makes me think about my own interpretation. You know, without having a lot of time to think about it, I would characterize the crux of the disagreement this way. Is the greater meaning-making power of the novel based on very elaborate content, scenes, characters, right, the 300 pages of material? Or is the most powerful meaning-making dynamism of the novel based on this framing device of the confession? And it's a framing device which sort of allows you to take any of the content and say, what that content seems to say, it's actually the opposite, because the content is actually being produced to follow the orthodox scripts of the communist state. You know, it's a very clever aspect of the novel, I think, and I think very smart of you to pick up on it. And I kind of feel like it's a judgment call, actually, right? You could go either way. I feel, you know, relatively confident that based on when I read it, you know, I recognized that it was a confession at some point, but that seemed more of a technique of self-protection to me than it seemed like the central point of the novel. And I would just say, in conclusion, that it's, you know, you have Foucault's description of a confession. It's a kind of theoretical account of what happens in a confession. But there's also a large body of empirical research about what happens in a confession. And a confession is not necessarily a site-absent resistance. People can find ways in a confession to get to express views that go against the paradigm that their confessor is looking for. There's a lot of scholarship in Southeast Asian studies, from Vince Raphael's work to actually my own work on Nhân Zai Phum defendants and how they dealt with confession. So, you know, even if we say that, even if we accept that the confession is significant, I think it's not totally decisive or determinative. It still leaves a little bit of wiggle room. And I guess lastly, if you're going, you know, if you're going to accept your argument that this is this whole 300 pages of the novel is crafted to give the confessor what he wants to hear, okay, well, that might explain why the portrayal of the Republic of Vietnam is so negative. But you'd have to then be consistent and show how it, you know, explains the rest of the novel. So, for example, there's a big middle section of the novel. It's really about the representation of Vietnamese in American war films. I don't think that's, in my view, in my experience, that has never been a major concern for re-education camp confessor guards, as well as many of the other, dozens and dozens of issues that are raised in the novel. I guess you could look at each one and say, well, this could be aligned with what the confessor wants to hear, but it strikes me as a stretch. And I feel like that the greater vibe that emanates from the novel actually comes from patterned content in it, rather than the frame. So I'd be interested to hear your response.
Thank you. I'm glad I sway you a little bit. And yeah, the advantage of coming to a conference and not having prepared a presentation is that you can actually write it on the fly, and you can quickly respond. So I take your point, but I do think that your critique yesterday is not totally, like I don't totally disagree with it. I do think that Viet Nguyen himself is critical of the RBN. Ain't nothing of a diet. He does say things that, is a corrupt, whatever. And yes, he could use with more nuance, and if he were here, he would probably learn a thing or two. But I think that, but he's also very critical of the communist regime, right? And I don't want to discount that. And so what do we make of this? What is that position that he occupies to critique both the RBN and the communist regime, right? In this text, addressed quite explicitly to American readers. And I call that space diaspora. I think that is a diasporic space of creativity that allows, and the point that people tend to forget too is that the text has not been translated into Vietnamese. And I asked him about it, and he said they have translated it, the government doesn't want it published. So if it toes the line so well, why would why would the regime not allow it, right? It would, you see what I mean?
But I'm not saying it toes the line. That's a different argument.
Yeah, so anyway, I get your point, but so the text does a lot of different things, and it's not a coincidence that in literary studies, it takes, we call the genre the picaresque, right? A picaro is a character that kind of jumps from one situation to another. He's like a trickster, he kind of a chameleon, shapes here and there. Like, that's a very long tradition of literature. So he takes on that novelistic tradition as well to write this spy character with no name. And I think the confusion comes from, or the layered meanings come from the choice of genre. All of this can be contained in the space of the novel.
Sorry, we have about 5 minutes left, so just to kind of give everybody a time check, I think we have 2 questions. Olga, I saw your hand was up. So we can take these 2 questions, and then, I don't want to cut what is actually a very, very fascinating discussion, but we have about 5 minutes left.
I don't really have a question, but I like to sort of express my opinion about a couple of things. I was somewhat obviously interested in how you translate the word nation in English. In our language, I think we call đất nước is nation, and we call nhà nước is government. And therefore our concept of nation and government is very simple. Wherever there's land and water, that's our home. And that's why we are pretty flexible in terms of where we want to live, and we want to make it our home. If there's land and water, đất nước, that's our home. The same thing, nhà nước, that's government. In the simple language of the Vietnamese, đất nước, nhà nước, that's all they think about. That's all I have.
if you go, if we were to go through the publications from the late 1970s and early 1980s, from especially France, but also in the U.S., you can flip to any page and you can find these 4 lines from Tang Da. Nước non nặng một lời thề, nước đi đi mãi không về cùng non, dọc cho sông cạn đá hồng, còn non còn nước, hãy còn thề chung. So in fact, you're right to say that everyone was thinking about exactly those 2 words, and it was obviously shown on those pages.
Actually, when Peter was talking, I was thinking to ask you to put it into the wider context of Viet Thanh Nguyen's work, because this sympathizer right now doesn't exist as a standalone. As you said, you look at Nothing Never Dies and his other writings, and then it just doesn't transpire that he was writing a confession that he didn't believe in.
Can you clarify that last point about belief?
That it was not something that he was writing in order to abate his persecutors, but this is something that he believes in, because he repeats quite a number of the points that he brings up in the novel in his other writings that are already not confessions unless you consider all his writing confessions.
Well, in the space of the narrative, he is tortured. I mean, sorry to spoil it for those who haven't read it. He's tortured to the point of almost death. And I find, I mean, how do you like that? You know? So, no, I don't agree that he believes in everything that's written. I think that he's...
But for example, about the South Vietnamese army, about his ideas of viability of South Vietnam.
Sure. I mean, and I think this is where we can agree or disagree, and I think scholars themselves have agree or disagree about like the effectiveness of various southern regimes, right? And you know, Yim, whether he was a good leader or he was a corrupt leader, you know. And I think that I agree that maybe he espouses some of the more orthodox view of Yim, for example, right? And the you know, the kind of the tagline of the South Vietnamese government is ineffective because it relies too much on American aid, right? And also leaders of the southern government looked out more for themselves than for their people. Okay, we can dispute that, we can critique that, and certainly bring more nuance to that. You know, but at the same time, I think that as a, you know, a refugee himself, I mean, he came to Indiatown camp in Pennsylvania as a refugee, and his parents are very connected to the Southern government, as far as I know. I don't think that he like just holds that view that the Southern, you know, government was completely terrible, and you know, therefore the North won, and you know, whatever. I think that there is a lot of critical power in his critical work and in his novels. And Nothing Never Dies, he does talk about how how authoritarian the northern regime is, and the violation of human rights. I mean, all of these things that are critical of North Vietnam. And I don't know, we don't have much time. The last point I want to make too, he intervenes in the field of Asian American studies. That's the field that he came from, he got trained in it. And one thing that he grappled with for a long time, and people don't appreciate this enough, is how he tried to challenge the genesis of Asian American studies that came out of the anti-war movement, right, in the 1960s. And his first book, Race and Resistance, tries really hard to say that, you know, this idea that Asian Americans all come together because we are critical of this U.S. empire and racialization of Asians during the Vietnam War, and that's terrible. He said that doesn't work for all Asian American groups, and he's really talking particularly about Vietnamese Americans who were, you know, U.S. allies and who don't fall into that pattern of critiquing U.S. involvement everywhere that easily. So I think that he's more complicated, you know, than we generally allow, and I want to delve into the nuance rather than cast him as, you know, put him in a box or something.
Unfortunately, we have to stop, but of course, you know, everyone is welcome if they have any additional questions for the panelists to see them after the panel. But I wanted to thank the panelists for their fantastic papers, and thank you everyone, and please join me in applauding our